How much do you think this election is going to be just about Brexit? Because we know that voters have a funny habit of deciding what they think are their priorities rather than what the politicians tell them they should be.
Well, I take that view. I'm so used to knocking on doors and finding, the most extraordinary reasons that people find to vote in any particular way. The caprice of the British voter on their own doorstep is just extraordinary. So there's no knowing what people are going to choose as the issue which will determine their vote, and you've just got to, make your case as best you can.
And how crucial is it for you, as someone who was a prominent Brexiteer all the way back, long before it was fashionable, but in 2016 and onwards, how crucial do you think the decision that we're going to get tomorrow from Nigel Farage, the leader of the Brexit Party, and the chairman, Mike Shapps, that they are not going to stand, as they planned, some 600 candidates over the 650 constituencies across the UK, and that they may well stand possibly fewer than 100, possibly some people saying as few as 20, and actually target key seats, probably in the North, seats that are unlikely to be won by the Tories, although they're key target seats by the Tories, but seats where they're not going to be splitting that Leave vote, leaving a free run for Conservative leavers across the rest of the country. How crucial is that, do you think, to Boris Johnson's success in this campaign?
I think it's significant. I wouldn't go so far as saying it's crucial, because there are all sorts of things that will happen in the campaign that we can't predict, and which may turn out themselves to be crucial or very significant. What I would say is that, we've had this at every election with the previous incarnation in terms of the UKIP party. There was always the suggestion that they weren't going to stand in particular seats, and then they were, and then they weren't, and in the end they did. So I'm a bit sceptical about anything we're told about the plan until actually you see the nominations on the paper. I think it's quite important, it's quite significant, but I wouldn't go so far as saying it was critical or crucial.
And in terms of what the battlegrounds are going to be, the Labour Party are making their big launch today, and it's very much going to be about sort of the people versus the elites. Now, your party leader is very much people versus Parliament. Jo Swinson of the Liberal Democrats, it's about the people's vote. They want a second referendum, or to actually revoke Article 50. They got, in the unlikely circumstances, a majority government of Liberal Democrats. Everyone's trying to be on the side of the people. This might be something of a problem.
Well, the people will decide which side the people are on. But I think it is. Yeah, I do see the election in terms of, Parliament against people. This Parliament has dithered and delayed Brexit several times, notwithstanding the vote of the people. And just one extraordinary, I think sums it all up. Just earlier this week, when we dealt with the election bill, amendments were put down and supported by all the opposition parties, which were the intention of which, of course, they never got very far, but nevertheless they were supported by the oppositions, and the intention was to give EU citizens the vote in our general election. And I just think, for a country that voted to leave the EU and then its parliament is attempting to give EU citizens the votes in our general election, just sums up the absurdity of our parliament against people. It is a parliament against the people.
There are going to be some concerns for your party, though. We know the NHS is a big issue. Now, there's some polling today suggesting that more people now trust the Tories than the Labour Party on the NHS. But again, it's long been the view that the NHS is Labour territory, the economy is Tory territory. But there are claims, from the Labour Party that the NHS is going to be sold off. That it's all going to be, part of this big Brexit, this post-Brexit trade deal with the United States. A lot of that is gaining traction. Now, it may just be that that's online, and it may be that it doesn't actually permeate for everyone else, but an awful lot of people are being influenced by that. That's a big risk for Boris Johnson and your party, isn't it? That key issues like spending on public services, that plays in when people are concerned about that after all these years of austerity. That is a vote winner for the Labour Party and not for the Conservative Party.
You're right. It is a risk. I think Labour is responding to what has happened in recent polling, which has shown the Tories taking a lead on the NHS, and that's why they've hatched this. This nightmare scenario. Somehow we're going to sell the NHS to the USA. I mean, it is the most monstrous nonsense. But nevertheless, we have to be alive to that attack and pitch our campaign accordingly.
And in terms of these MPs standing down, we've seen some very prominent names, the likes of Amber Rudd, Nicky Morgan, David Livingstone, Patrick McLaughlin, Sir Alan Duncan. They're among the 58 MPs who said they're going to stand down. Been a lot of talk about how these prominent women leaving sooner than perhaps many would suggest their age or their career prospects would suggest. And a lot of this, we're told, is down to abuse. Now, we spoke to Liz Truss, the International Trade Secretary, a little bit earlier, and was saying, she defends robust political debate and just simply doesn't bother reading the comments on Twitter from people if they're being abusive. Do you think that the quality of political discourse and the abuse that MPs are getting on all sides these days is a problem and is forcing a lot of people, possibly mainly women, out of politics?
Yes, I think it is. I don't think there's anything wrong with the robustness of our political discourse and debate here in Parliament. I'm all for maintaining that. It's the social media, and I take the view that Liz Truss does. I simply do not read any notifications on social media, which is a shame because I'm not using it as a means of allowing my constituents to communicate with me. Because it's just so toxic what anybody is saying out there that it's better not to read it at all. So if constituents want to communicate with me, they have to either write a letter or email me. Because if they send social media messages, I'm not going to read them simply for the sake of my own sanity.
Do you think more people should take that advice? Or
Yes,
is that also a way of perhaps, avoiding political debate, avoiding voters?
Well, it is a shame because it does close down an avenue that people would otherwise have of communicating with their members of Parliament. But the difficulty, of course, there is that you can't tell who is your constituent and who isn't. But nevertheless, it is a means of sort of separating members of Parliament from the people. But I think it's a necessary discipline simply because of the toxic nature of what is out there. Okay. I think, to tell you the truth, what I think part of the psychology of this is, if you're on your own phone or your own laptop, you're in your own personal space, and you say things that you wouldn't dream of putting on paper or saying face to face or in public. It's a bit like the psychology of being in your own car. People swear and use language and shout in their own cars in a way that they would never do outside. And I think being on your own phone and laptop is a bit the same sort of psychology. And people are just not just behave very badly.
We are in full election mode, even though Parliament's still sitting, not officially starting the election, but Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn's launching his campaign today. Very much all about being on the side of the people against the elites, the big business, big money, big banks. And he says that those are the people who are being represented by the Conservatives. That's going to play very well with a large section of the electorate. Are you worried about that?
Oh, look, everybody stands for election with and for the people. We all have the same electors. And I think the thing about Jeremy Corbyn is he wants to sort of set up some sort of, imaginary class war. And sort of, I guess he's probably panicking a bit. He will have seen some of the news headlines this morning, which show that Conservatives are trusted more now on the NHS, for example, because we're putting £34 billion into it, this massive rise. And I think he's kind of therefore kind of trying to go for the base Corbyn vote. But making us more like Venezuela won't make this country successful. We need to get out there, embrace business, the companies that have led to record low unemployment in this country, and then concentrate on the issues that people care about, the NHS, levelling up education for all the kids in primary and secondary schools and dealing with violent crime. And that's the Conservative platform for this election, of course, alongside getting Brexit done.
OK, now let's talk about whether you can get Brexit done or not. If there is going to be this big dividing line on Brexit, and we've got the Brexit Party and the Conservative Party promising to deliver a version of Brexit, we've got the Liberal Democrats and Labour, and even though Labour said they want a second referendum, they said the majority of the shadow cabinet and the party would campaign to remain in the event that there was the second referendum held under their terms. So you've got two Remain parties, two Leave parties. The news today, this is on the front page of the Telegraph, that the Brexit Party could aid the Tories by not fighting in hundreds of seats, expecting to get an announcement tomorrow that instead of running in, say, 600 and 650 seats, they're going to be looking at 100 or even fewer seats, possibly targeting a crucial 20 that perhaps the Tory party would have very little chance of winning in areas where perhaps Labour Leave vote is strong, but people perhaps might not be willing to go to vote for the Tories. Is this going to be a game changer for your party? Even though there's no formal pact, effectively the Brexit Party is going to all intents and purposes, endorse the Leave vote going to Tories in most constituencies?
Look, I don't know. You recall I was the party chairman in the 2015 election that we won. And I remember in the lead up to that election being told constantly that if UKIP stood and if we stood, we couldn't possibly get a majority, because we did get a majority in that election. And my view as party chairman at the time was clear. We just have to stand everywhere. We are the Conservative Party. We stand in all parts of our nation. And we appeal for people to vote for us. In this case, when it comes to Brexit, whether you voted Remain or Leave, we just want to get it done and behind us. And we've got we've got a deal with that even Parliament agreed with it, just won't find the time to put it through. So if you vote for us, we get Brexit done by Christmas. It's a good deal, it's a great deal, but we don't crash out or whatever. I think that's the simplest thing to say. We will fight in every seat. What other parties do, well, that's their business, of course.
There are an awful lot of MPs who are standing down. Of the Tory MPs, and we're talking about 58 MPs standing down. A lot of fuss there about particular MPs like Amber Rudd, Nicky Morgan, although we understand Nicky Morgan is actually a personal family decision that perhaps he doesn't want to talk about publicly. But others, David Lidington, Patrick McLaughlin, Sir Alan Duncan, largely it's Remainers standing down, but there's also a lot of talk that it's about women and it's about the level of abuse, the unpleasant discourse that we now have in our politics. How much of a problem do you think that is?
Well, I think the only bit of that which is true, I mean, some of these individuals, Patrick McLaughlin and Ken Clarke, people like that, and David Livingstone, who I just saw, actually standing down because they'd like to do something else with their lives or retire. So I don't think there's kind of, lots made of these things. It's also, by the way, true to say that I think in 2010 election, for example, 159 MPs stood down, and at the moment we've got sort of 50 plus here have said they'll stand down. So there's a lot of media attention on this, but not a particularly high, in fact, a lower than usual proportion of people standing down. But I do agree with you on this issue of, abuse and what have you. I was the first MP to go onto Twitter. I remember in the early days, I'd read my Twitter feed and thread and see all the abuse. And, you just think, my goodness, no one would come up to you in the street and say these things, but people seem to think online it's all right to say. I dealt with it largely just by not reading it. But I do think that for some of our colleagues who really suffered at the hands of these trolls online, and particularly some of our female colleagues, it is completely unacceptable. People, we absolutely as a society need to, dial it down and recognise that we can all have different views, even on issues that we feel passionately about, like Brexit. But actually, it doesn't make the person with the opposite view, somehow evil and deserving of the kind of abuse that we've seen. And I'm really keen that public life that does take on some of that kind of reasonableness and humanity.
What about the idea that actually a lot of these MPs who are standing down are actually rather fearful of the judgment of the electorate? And actually a lot of people are very angry. And although it's not acceptable for them to be abusive or to make threats to people, they're entitled to express their anger at MPs who they feel, I would say correctly, are not actually living up to the promises they made when they were elected. A lot of Conservative MPs who are standing down are MPs who said they would abide by the election, the referendum result from 2016, said that they would they stood on an election campaign in 2017 and a manifesto promising to deliver Brexit, and then have tried to stop it from happening. I mean, when are voters allowed to be angry and take it out on the elected representatives? If not,
the simple answer is that at the ballot box, of course, because that's where the time when you can literally eject us from our jobs, which is a pretty sort of summary dismissal. So I think that's a very good time. And of course, people should be able to have lively debate and use humour and sarcasm and just bluntly disagree. But it should never, ever kind of get into the kind of personal and even threat territory that we've seen over the past few years. Of course, that should never ever happen. Okay. And I think it also is worth saying, as you have reflected, quite a lot of people stand down have actually already left the parties that they were in, and so probably are a bit concerned about restanding because they have themselves moved from the parties they represented on all sides. So there is a bit of that as well.
Now, although you're no longer in the Labour Party, we know you're a big ally of the Labour leadership. This line, it does seem that we've got the Tories going for people versus Parliament on the side of the people. Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party going for there's people versus the the elite, the vested interest, and Labour on the side of the people. And we've got the Liberal Democrats saying that, people's vote, they're on the side of the people who want to remain. Everyone's on the side of the people. But how's that going to play with the electorate if everyone's claiming to be on the side of the people?
Well, everyone's claiming to be that. But during this election campaign, Labour will be publishing a lot of the data about what actually happened in the 9 years since Cameron and the Lib Dems formed their coalition, because over the last 9 years, we've seen bigger cuts and damage to our health service and our schools than we saw under Thatcher. I mean, can you imagine Mrs Thatcher deciding to cut the number of police by 22,000? And so, literally, this is the worst government of my lifetime. And it's all been about all the wealth being created in Britain is going to the richest 1/10 of 1%. Ordinary people, in real terms, are earning less than they were 10 years ago.
And yet, although we know austerity has been very unpopular, there's also been quite a lot of polling suggesting that people understand that certainly in the wake of the economic crash, and whether the Labour Party is blamed for the economic crash or not, the Labour government was in charge at the time of the crash in 2007, 2008. The austerity, to some extent, whether they agree with the extent it went, was necessary to get back to balancing the books. The country would have been completely going to the dogs if we hadn't actually cut back public spending at that time, surely.
Well, no, actually, this is the thing. I mean, we were in that economic crisis because we've had, literally 40 years of Labour and Tory governments taking real control of the financial system, and it got more risky, more dodgy. I mean, back in, I think, 1986, Thatcher removed most of the rules regulating the way that the banks were run. And so we've ended up with a banking system, not just here, but in America, around the world, where they were taking more and more terrible risks. And that's what led to the crisis. I mean, not because we were spending too much on hospitals or schools or anything. And if you look at the post-war Labour government in 1945, they inherited debt which was 2.5 times our annual GDP. And now, at the moment, now it's just over 8%. But they didn't cut public spending. They created more jobs, expanded the welfare state, created the NHS. And 30 years later, that debt was down to just 40%. And so cutting public spending does not lift you out of this crisis. It just means more people are on the dole, more people sleeping rough on the street.
Well, OK, but we know more people on the dole. We know that actually a lot of the economic figures are actually rather good for the Tories, aren't we? Lowest unemployment for decades. We've got relatively low inflation. We've got a lot of other low interest rates, a lot of other factors that will feed into the pound in your pocket. When people point to the idea that all elections are won, the economy's stupid, that's the key factor. Even though we have had austerity, the fact that the spending has now begun again, and Boris Johnson, slightly under Theresa May, but more under Boris Johnson, announcement of these big spending for the NHS and the like, is that not going to suggest to people that, those years are over, you don't have to choose between Tory austerity and Labour spending because the spending taps have already been turned on?
But you actually look at the record of all the Tory and the Blair government over this last 40 years. They cut taxes for the richest, and the wealth shifted towards the richest. And Boris Johnson's completely caught up in that. He's a part of that elite establishment. Little public school boy went to Eton, then off to Oxford. I mean, literally. And then you look at his 8 years as mayor. I mean, he did virtually nothing. He built the cable car to nowhere, but he spent all his time promoting himself. And if you look, The 3 months he's been Prime Minister, every day he's there on the television doing some PR stunt, leading people through a farm or in a school talking to kids. If you become Prime Minister, you need to be in Downing Street sorting out the mess, creating a proper economic strategy to get you forward. I mean, if you remember, in the first 2 years I was mayor, journalists were complaining, where is he? I was actually in the office doing the job.
Okay, let's talk about some of the key issues though coming up. Obviously, we talk about the public services. Again, a lot of the Tory argument is we've got to deliver Brexit. We're the only party that will deliver Brexit so we can then get on and talk about and focus on things like the NHS, schools, roads and all of that. The NHS has traditionally been something that is a Labour policy. That's, people trust the Labour Party on the NHS more than they do the Conservative Party, but they trust the economy to the Tories more. And there's a very traditional ground. But the latest poll we've seen at the front of the Daily Mail, but it's a poll, carried out by a reputable polling company. They're saying that actually more people now, only marginally, but more people now trust Boris Johnson over Jeremy Corbyn on the issue of the NHS. 36% of voters say Boris Johnson's got the best policies on health. 34% say Jeremy Corbyn. That's a pretty big change in fortune on that issue, given that that's supposed to be a big vote winner. Is it a good idea for Jeremy Corbyn to talk about the NHS being up for grabs and up for sale by the Americans in a Brexit trade deal when actually people aren't trusting him as much on the NHS?
Yeah, but then most people haven't seen the truth about what would happen if we do allow American corporations to start taking over a big chunk of our NHS.
But wait a second. You know that American companies and companies based in the EU are currently able to get contracts with the NHS. That already happens.
Yes, if we're leaving the EU, all the regulation controls are gone and we can be ripped off. And you actually look, I mean, literally, every serious business organisation and economic study group, all of them predict leaving the EU is going to cost us jobs and our economy will grow less than if we stayed in. And so the simple fact is, you just don't get this in all the Tory press is just filled endlessly with lies and smears. And if you go back to the 2017 election, at the start of that election, I mean, Jeremy was about 25% behind the Tories. He closed it to just 2%. Because once you hit the election, radio and television, all of those programmes have to give balanced coverage. You suddenly have more honesty. And I think people are much more likely to believe what they hear on radio or TV than what they read in the Telegraph or the Daily Express.
OK, well, let's just talk finally about Brexit. Of course, finally about Brexit, but of course it's going to be, we think, the biggest issue in the election. Of course, the Lib Dems, very, very clear message. We remain. If we got a majority, unlikely on the polling, but if they got a majority, they would revoke Article 50. They certainly want a second referendum. Tories very clear. We've got the Brexit deal. Brexit Party, they want a no-deal Brexit, although it looks like they're going to be standing aside for Tory candidates for the Brexit deal as well. Labour Party, still an awful lot of people unclear about what the Labour Party policy is on Brexit. The idea of negotiating a new Brexit deal in 6 months that's apparently somehow better, but then campaigning possibly to remain in another referendum on that deal. And I mean, that is pretty hard to explain to people on the doorstep. If you want Brexit, why would you vote Labour? And if you want Remain, why would you vote Labour?
Well, it's quite simple. I mean, Jeremy has always respected people's democratic rights and people voted to leave. So Jeremy's been consistent right through this period that, I mean, the only way to change that is you've got to go back and let the people have another referendum. And I think that's the right thing to do. Jeremy will, if he becomes Prime Minister, will negotiate a better deal, but it will still not be as good as remaining in the EU. And if you look, the overwhelming majority of shadow cabinet members are all going to be campaigning to remain when we hit that referendum. And I'll be joining them.
Now, your party is gambling on the fact that, this is all about Brexit, and you are the Remain party, the Revoke Article 50 party. You've been very clear about that for a longer time, certainly a longer time than the Labour Party, and that is what you're standing on. Do you think that the vote being standing as the Remain party is going to be enough to get you over the line and to deliver what Joe Swinson apparently expects, which is to be the next Prime Minister?
Well, I think she's right to be ambitious. When I was leader, I said the same thing. I mean, if you're leader of a serious party, you want to lead the country. And of course, it's a big stretch for us because we're coming from 11 MPs, and to win outright, we'd need 300. But it's good to have ambition, and she has it. And expresses it very well. But we're certainly going to make a lot of progress. I mean, we can argue about how many seats, but all the indications are we're going to do well.
Well, she's already been quite scathing about about the other leaders being old, and she, of course, is just 39. But I mean, does she think that people are perhaps don't have a role in the top levels of politics because they are older than her? Because I have a funny feeling, well, both myself and yourself are older than her, Sir Vince. Do you feel a little bit put out by that?
No, I take it in good heart. I mean, I was her predecessor and, in a way, paved the way for the success which I'm sure she will enjoy. But I was happy enough to hand over to a young woman, and I think there is a mood for that. But I like you, I defend the role of older people in politics. We need a blend, don't we?
Indeed. And what do you make of the MPs who've decided to stand down? A lot of those Remain MPs, really well-known figures like Amber Rudd, Nicky Morgan, although Nicky Morgan had still in government and right now, and had actually signed up to the Boris Brexit deal. We understand she's leaving for personal family reasons. Others, David Lidington, Patrick McLaughlin. There's been a lot of talk that actually a lot of this is about just how unpleasant being a politician is now, the level of abuse, the quality of political discourse, the lack of respect for politicians these days. Do you feel that?
No, I don't actually. I mean, maybe I'm fortunate, maybe because I'm a man. I mean, whatever reason, I haven't found the last few years intimidating and alarming. Most of the people I disagree with, like you, I find very polite, and we have good conversations. And I found British politics much more violent and troubling, in the years back. I mean, in the Thatcher years, we had the miners' strike, we had the poll tax riots. Before that, we had Enoch Powell and Rivers of Blood, and I had a mixed marriage at the time, and I found all that very threatening. But I found today we continue to have democratic debate, even though we disagree with each other. So, but I don't want to be complacent. I mean, I know some people had a very rough time, and Heidi Allen is one of our party people who joined us.
Briefly.
I know she's had stalking and very unpleasant attacks. So I'm sensitive to other people's discomfort, but you asked me about my experience, and I haven't had that experience. I'm just retiring because I want to, and I've got things to do with my life.
Do you think, though, that it is reasonable, though not people, stalking, threats of rape and violence and killing, I mean, obviously completely unacceptable and completely criminal as well, but in terms of constituents and voters, letting MPs know that they are angry with them and saying to them, you're a traitor, saying to them they feel that they have reneged on their promises and they're liars and dishonest and they want to have them booted out. Are voters entitled to say that to their elected representatives if they do feel they have been betrayed?
Well, within limits, yes. I mean, people are totally entitled to express their views. I have to say, when I was a member of the coalition, when I think we were acting in the national interest and trying to save the country from an economic disaster, I mean, I had people spitting in the streets and being extremely unpleasant, more so than now. So, there are limits and there's good manners, and there's a spectrum of things from people just expressing their views frankly through abuse to violence, and, we've got to be careful to be on the right side of that spectrum.
And in terms of where this campaign goes, obviously Brexit's going to be a big issue, very much a big issue for your party. One of the reasons why you wanted an early election in case a Brexit deal did get delivered, and that's kind of it rather deflates the Liberal Democrat balloon. But there was also talk of a Remain alliance. We've seen that in past by-elections where we've seen, say, the Green Party, Plaid Cymru, others sort of standing aside for the Lib Dems. However, unlikely to happen with the Labour Party. If you are competing for Remain votes with the Labour Party, up against the Tories and the Brexit Party, but it looks like the Brexit Party are going to stand down. We're expecting that announcement tomorrow in many seats across the country, leaving the free rein to the Tories to hoover up all those Leave voters. If there isn't a Remain alliance, whether formal or informal, and there is effectively this informal Leave alliance, that's going to do you a lot of damage, isn't it?
Well, we'll see. I'd be surprised if there's a Leave alliance in view of all the rude things that Nigel Farage has been saying about the Conservatives and the deal they've got or haven't got. No, I think there will be an agreement with the smaller parties, and talking of the Greens, Plaid Cymru, some of the independents, as a sort of seat agreements. We've already done that, and it will develop. And elsewhere, I think voters will take matters into their own hands, and there will be a lot of tactical voting. I mean, we obviously can't tell people how to vote and don't want to. People make their own choices. But I think there will be an enormous amount of tactical voting. And I went to an exercise yesterday organised by Best for Britain, in which they show that if 30% of all Labour, Liberal, Democrat, Green voters choose to vote tactically in favour of Remain candidates, we will certainly deprive the government of a majority.
Let's talk a little bit about this possibility of, again, very much not a formal pact. We know there's no love lost whatsoever between Nigel Farage, the leader of the Brexit Party, and Dominic Cummings, the former leader of the Vote Leave campaign, well, the man behind the Vote Leave campaign that you were chair of. And he's, of course, now the senior advisor to Boris Johnson in Number 10. But it does look like we are going to see an announcement from the Brexit Party that they're not going to stand candidates in all constituencies across the country, and that they are going to go for some target seats which they feel they've got a better chance of winning than the Tories, and the Tories are going to get a free run. That is, to all intents and purposes, an informal alliance. Is that going to deliver it for Boris Johnson?
Well, there's nothing new in that. I mean, even I remember when I got elected in 1997, the Labour Party had what they called the key seat strategy, that if you've got resources, you focus them. And given that the Brexit Party probably would find it difficult to have a sufficient number of candidates and people on the ground, it makes sense that they focus on things. But it makes even more sense that if you think leaving the United Kingdom is something of the European Union, for that we require a government majority, that the Brexit Party shouldn't deliberately split that leave vote. So I think it just makes strategic sense.
And how much do you think this is going to be an election? You stood down in 2017, and how much do you think this is going to still be an election about Brexit? Because, of course, famously people say, well, we had a Brexit election in 2017, but, of course, the two major parties, Labour and the Tory party, were both promising to implement the Brexit referendum result. Now we're in a very different position, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's where the actual party manifestos are going to be really, really important, because, as you so rightly say, in 2017, the two major parties promised to deliver the results of the referendum. And if we end up with a division of the Conservative Party is clear they're leaving, if the Lib Dems say we're clear, we are staying, whatever, and if Labour positions itself by saying, vote for us and you have two more referendums, one on the EU and one in Scotland, then I think Labour will find it very difficult. And that saddens me.
And how much do you think there's an issue in terms of abuse and things in politics? Lots of focus being on the fact that Amber Rudd, Nicky Morgan, lots of other prominent Remainers, particularly lots of women standing down. Again, if you actually crunch the numbers, you realise actually it's a no higher percentage of women than there are of women MPs in Parliament. And actually we've seen far more MPs stand down at previous elections. 149 MPs stood down back in 2010. It just, these things tend to go in phases. But how much do you think that sort of the level of political discourse that we've been discussing with Vince Cable, the animosity, the abuse is now something that is putting people, maybe perhaps especially women, off being involved in politics? Did it affect you?
I mean, it's actually a really tricky question to ask, Julia, because you have to know what is being said, and you have to remain the kind of person who can't just shrug it off, because otherwise you really become so thick-skinned. And that's why you need strong teams around you. So, I mean, when the death threats start coming in, you need to take this personally and take it up with the police. But there are other things where you have to say, look, I'm just not letting you get to me. But, Julia, the thing which worries me much, much more is if I look at the age profile of the MPs which are stepping down. And it would seem to me that more mid-career politicians are saying, this is not where my future is. I think, I haven't done the number crunching, but if you go back to 2010, the previous 3 terms of Parliament have been extremely stable. So there were a lot of people sort of stepping down after 10, 15, 20 years in Parliament. If we have that and we stop people mid-career coming in, then I do think the House of Commons deprives itself of a skills base.